As I mentioned in my story earlier, faith community has always been part of my life. Throughout college and into a young adulthood, I continued to attend church regularly. It was in college, in fact, that I found Unitarian Universalism in this small fellowship in Beaumont, Texas. When I moved to New York City to pursue a career in musical theater, I began attending All Souls Church on the Upper West Side and volunteering with a religious education program there. The rest, as they say, is history. I have watched in my time, though, how the brick and mortar faith community has seemingly lost relevance for a large portion of our Western society. In general, numbers of people attending worship services and congregations of all faiths have dwindled, especially in the last 20 years or so. There are many reasons for this, not the least of which is the digital age, the rising number of Americans who identify as spiritual but not religious, and the influence of white supremacy culture on faith life. I will pause and recognize that if it were not for the digital age, we could not be meeting in this format now. I am certainly not knocking technology. In fact, in the small virtual groups I have been attending since my arrival here in April, I am hearing that people are feeling more connected in some ways because they are able to meet and chat with those they may never have approached on a regular Sunday and Sunday morning coffee hour, for instance. In this digital connection, however, this opportunity we all have now on many social networking platforms that allows us to create community for ourselves in a myriad of ways. Now, for me, this could never take the place of in-person social and faith opportunities. But I am of Generation X. I am not a digital native, and for those who are, their social and even religious needs are often met in the virtual space. I lift up, as an example of the relevance of religious virtual space, our largest Unitarian Universalist congregation, the Church of the Larger Fellowship, which is entirely online and has members from around the world. This is actually great news for the relevance of Unitarian Universalism in the larger world, and it also points to the reality that if we are to remain relevant, we must continue to address the digital needs of our evolving social culture when we are back together in physical space. We also have the responsibility as Unitarian Universalists to create in our brick and mortar spaces something different than what is experienced in our white supremacist culture. Families of all structures, from single person to families with children, especially families with children, they come looking to us for that something different. They come looking to us for community, for hands-on support, and for a salve to ease their hurts. Can we be that antidote? If we can't answer yes, I fear that we will lose our relevance and growth will be impossible. Juana Bordas, in her book, Salsa, Soul, and Spirit, Leadership for a Multicultural Age, offers us a possibility for what something different might look like. In the book, she outlines what she calls a new social covenant that lifts up three principles. One is Sankofa, which we have been talking about, the recognition that we must honor, respect, and examine the past in order to understand the present. The second principle is moving from I to we, from individualism to collective identity. And the third mi casa es su casa, a true spirit of generosity that holds collectivist cultures together. So let's explore these three principles, shall we? Taking a closer look at Sankofa, the actual meaning translates to, it is not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind. Sankofa asks us to look to the teachings of our ancestors, to bring forward what is useful, to integrate the past into the present, and then shape the future. We have so many Unitarian Universalist ancestors who have offered us lessons that we must not leave behind. I'm thinking of Henry David Thoreau, who wrote his activist proclamation, Civil Disobedience, in 1849, that if the government requires people to participate in injustice by obeying unjust laws, then people should break the laws. His writings went on to influence both Gandhi and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who taught the world about the power of civil disobedience and peaceful protest. I am also thinking of Fannie Berrier Williams, a Black suffragist who not only helped women get the chance to vote, she also assisted in starting a hospital in Chicago where everyone was welcome, no matter the color of their skin. Fannie herself would not live long enough to get the vote, but she did help found the NAACP with such notables as Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois. When some groups kept people out, Fannie Berrier Williams started groups that let people in. And I'm also thinking about Maria Mitchell, a personal favorite, an insatiably curious child who asked thousands of questions. Mitchell overcame obstacles and broke social barriers as a 19th century woman to become a famous astronomer, one who discovered a comet even, and eventually went on to teach at the first women's college. Do you know which college that is? The first women's college, Vassar. Sankofa. I call on the lessons of Thoreau as I watch the overreach of the president sending federal agents to quote unquote restore order in Portland, Oregon, but who are instead escalating violence and choosing to intimidate peaceful protesters like the Wall of Moms with tear gas. I call on the spirit of Fannie Berrier Williams as we approach another national election where people of color continue to be marginalized by unjust regulations and laws. I call on Maria Mitchell when I think about the attack on science and even the sheer act of questioning under our current administration. We must not leave these lessons behind. Sankofa. I want to name one other ancestor, James Luther Adams, or JLA as he is sometimes known, a 20th century American theological professor and Unitarian parish minister, famous, well, certainly in religious circles, for his 5 smooth stones of liberalism. He wrote in the mid-20th century, idolatry occurs when a social movement adopts as the center for loyalty an idol, a segment of reality torn away from the context of universality, an inflated, misplaced abstraction made absolute. Liberalism, in its generalized form, has been the chief critic of the idolatries of creedalism, of church and political authoritarianism, of nationalistic, racial, or sexual chauvinism. But in its specialized form, it has generated a new idolatry, the idolatry of possessive individualism. This possessive individualism has served as a smokescreen, an ideology concealing or protective a new authoritarianism of economic corporate power. This idolatry in the name of individualism and the free market eschews responsibility for the social consequences of economic power. It has become virtually unaccountable to the general public. So here, James Luther Adams is naming the challenge Bordas addresses in her second principle, moving from I to we, from individualism to collective identity. Bordas explains how multicultural collectivist communities, or we cultures as she calls them, have a strong sense of belonging and sticking together. And the community takes precedence over the individual, whose identity flows from the collective. Collectivist communities also have highly defined rules or covenants, and therefore change more slowly than individualist culture. We cultures cherish group welfare, unity, and harmony. And because these communities are tightly woven, there is a wholeness in which differences can exist. Although Bordas is speaking of multicultural communities, religious communities such as ours strive to live into these values. As Unitarian Universalist covenantal faith communities, we have the opportunity to be the antidote for the isolation families of all kinds are experiencing in this I-oriented culture, or what we now fully own as white supremacist culture, and specifically the aspect of white supremacy culture which is individualism. Unfortunately, many people, having grown up in our white majority culture, simply do not know how to be in community. It is also important to name here that we are not starting as multicultural collectivist communities that Bordas lifts up in her book. So the qualities inherent in those communities do not come naturally to us. Unitarian Universalists have lifted up the importance of the individual journey for decades, even above the community. We will not be successful if we are not vigilant in breaking down this affinity for individualism and the many ways in which white supremacy manifests in our congregations, such as white supremacy shows up when a congregant is ashamed to ask for help, so they remain isolated. White supremacy shows up in the embarrassment families feel when they arrive on Sunday morning, not looking like the stock family photo in the Hallmark picture frame. White supremacy shows up when parents would prefer to pay for it rather than experience the relationship building and spiritual growth of volunteerism and owning their role as primary religious educator because they just don't have time. Keeping up with the Joneses, that consumerist aspect of white supremacy, is so detrimental to our faith communities. Collectivism, however, shows up when we invest in our faith community, knowing that our individual needs will be met, our minds will be challenged, and our hearts will be open and held. Collectivism shows up when we are given a second and third chance, when we are welcomed back 1,000 times because our covenant requires it of us. Collectivism shows up when we deepen our understanding of ourselves by being in relationship with others, which is when our identity flows from the collective. Ultimately, when we commit to learn from multicultural collectivist communities, we have the opportunity to help families of all kinds swing the pendulum from I to we. For families with children, this looks like parenting from the perspective of relationship instead of competence and abilities. And moving to the third and final principle, mikasa e sukasa, we can bridge collectivism and that spirit of generosity with a practice we have explored before. Bordas speaks to how relationships carry responsibility and refers to the African Xhosa concept of Ubuntu, translated as I am because we are. She says, like a tribal drumbeat, Ubuntu resonates across African cultures and wraps people together. My humanity is tied to your humanity. It is not an ethereal spiritual concept of oneness, but a real day-to-day obligation to be sharing, to be open and welcoming towards others. Since Ubuntu signifies that one's identity and well-being depends on other people, it underscores the collective and the tribe. The familiar saying, it takes a village to raise a child, reflects this and emphasizes people's communal responsibility to all children. In his book, Parenting Beyond Our Capacity, Carey Nieuwhof describes a ritual of connection he created for his son's 13th birthday that reflects Ubuntu. He invited 5 trusted people to spend a day with his son to impart one spiritual truth and give one piece of good advice. At the end of the summer, Nieuwhof gathered the 5 mentors for dinner with his family, where each shared a story of overcoming struggle in their own lives, as well as the gifts they witnessed in his son. Each offered a blessing with a promise to be a continued presence in his son's life. Nieuwhof knew it would impact his son, but was surprised by the tears of the mentors as they listened to each other's stories. Each shared their sense of isolation and loneliness in the world and expressed how they wished they had what my mentor and colleague, the Reverend Emily Bogus, termed a circle of 5. The circle of 5 broadens the scope and asks the question, what if we connected all new families with 5 active members who served as mentors to help the new families build relationships within the congregation, to discover their passions, and to learn how to use those talents to serve our faith family? Mi casa es su casa. My home is your home. I am because we are. As we close, I want to dream a bit, to think about the good things to come. What if everyone considered the teachings of their ancestors, carrying forward valuable lessons to serve us, especially in this unique time? Can you think of a personal ancestor whose voice would be really useful to you right now? Sankofa. What if we all prioritized group welfare, unity, and harmony, trusting that our individual voices are only strengthened when we do so? Collectivism. What if the sharing of our time, talent, and treasure always came from a place of joy and was even second nature. Mi casa es su casa. May it be so.